think we're good there. Let's make sure we're good here. Oh, this looks a lot better. I like this. So we'll give this a second here. We'll have IG coming on now too. I'm very excited today. A little bit under the weather, but I figured that make it a good time to talk a little bit about the immune system, right? So a lot of things obviously have come up around the immune system the last couple years. Definitely a bit of confusion when it comes to like what goes on, how you can boost it, and kind of what exactly we're looking for. Here's the thing, like the immune system in general is it's more of like a concept than a physical structure, right? Like you can't reach out and touch it the same way you could like a liver or a spleen or a stomach or the intestines. Like these are physical organs that you can actually touch, if and that you can actually put your hands on. If you ever did a human dissection, we obviously had to do it in school. So that is something that we could physically see and touch. The immune system though isn't really that. It's more conceptual, and it's more of things kind of happening on a daily basis, and then also using a variety of different cells that have different jobs and become more prevalent depending on what's going on. So, what's going on here, right? So, like, how does this all make sense? Well, remember, we've talked about this before. There's really only three main forms of stress, right? Physical, chemical, emotional. Talking about physical, you're talking about things like trauma, issues, not moving enough, lack of exercise. You're talking from maybe work. Emotional, this could be from financial, it could be a bad breakup, it could be relationships, it could be losing a job, it could be dealing with all the garbage that's been going on the last couple of years. Do you think that could not cause some emotional stress? Absolutely it could. And then you have chemical. This is largely, obviously we talk a lot about it when it comes to foods on here, but can it be from lack of sleep? Is it that we're eating food that is a really food like substances that are devoid of nutrients, and then you're consuming, and there's the kind of the backwards thing with like a lot of the food out there. Like we know that roughly like 80% of the food on store shelves today did not exist 50 years ago. And if we're going to consume that, we actually need to use up nutrients to help break down that food. So not only are you not replenishing the nutrients, you're also using up more to help break down what you already have. Then you have to talk about things like medications, like endocrine disruptors that we find in things like, say, your shampoos and soaps, detergents, cosmetics are huge, particularly with women. On average, your typical American woman, when you're doing a full face of makeup, that's going to be over 300 different chemicals. And we wonder why autoimmune type issues tend to be more common. I believe it's like 8 or 9 times more common in women than men. I think that has a lot to do with it. A lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, they tend to more mimic estrogen, and that not only has has negative effects on women, but it also does with men. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. And when we take a step back and look, in America, we're looking at you know rates now. 1 in every 2 people are expected to get cancer. 1 in 5 have some sort of autoimmune disorder. 1 in 10 have liver disease. Heart disease, we know, causes 1 in every 4 deaths. Um, we know around 40% or so are diabetic. Almost now, the number of dementia patients continue to rise on a regular basis. This is crazy. We also know that 54% of kids now have some sort of chronic illness in kids. So we're talking about these exposures, these stressors are becoming more common earlier, and they're causing issues, and they're affecting the immune system. So today I want to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about some of the basic white blood cells that we see on lab reports. So when you look at them, you kind of have an idea about what to look for. We're going to talk about the brain, and we're going to talk about the gut when it comes to immune system health. So first thing I want to do is actually talk about white blood cells, also known as leukocytes. So generally, these are going to last, around 11 to 16 days. They obviously they're going to make up a large part of our immune system. Now, if you remember, around 80% of our immune system is located in the gut, right? Right around that gut lining. So there's a lot of interplay between the immune system and the gut and the brain, and all of this correlates, like they all coalesce. And we're going to put those pieces all together today. Now, generally speaking, you're going to have your five main types of white blood cells, right? You're going to have neutrophils, you're going to have lymphocytes, you're going to have monocytes, you're going to have eosinophils, and you're going to have basophils. And I'll remember this, we learned it in school. There was a little little saying. It was called "Never let my engine blow." Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils. That's basically how you remembered all five. So if that's something you want to think of, those are the five different types. When you get a CBC with differential, the differential is kind of what they're talking about is the white blood cells. So that is ultimately kind of what we're talking about at the end of the day. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of them, right? So, and we're going to go in order of the ones that are the most common or the highest population of them to the lowest. So we'll start with neutrophils. So the reason it had the name Phil is because they're filled with little granulocytes. If you kind of look at them under a microscope, and they're known as kind of the first responders, right? So neutrophils, ideally, if they're over, I'd say like 60%, then you usually have an acute reaction or infection going on. Could be an inflammatory reaction, could be an infection. Generally, it is of bacterial origin when neutrophils are high. Now, it could happen sometimes with parasites. It could happen sometimes with fungal infections. It could be actually tissue damage, dying tissue, or inflammation. But usually, when neutrophils are high, when they are generally over 60% of the count, you're looking at usually a bacterial infection that is acute. So important to kind of keep that in mind. Lymphocytes generally are the second most common or most populous of them. So when lymphocytes are high, then you're thinking of an acute viral infection. So when lymphocytes get high, you're usually thinking again something viral is going on, but it's usually in the acute stage, right? Um, it could happen with other infections or malignancies, but generally it's going to be a viral infection that makes it high. So when lymphocytes are high, again, generally usually over 40%, then that something acute viral is going on. Okay. Monocytes then are the third most common of these. And when monocytes are high, usually they're associated with chronic issues, chronic infections that can be of bacterial or viral origin. However, when they're high, and usually when they're over something like 7%, it could mean that there's something going on fungal. It could mean that there's something going on that is yeast or mold, or it could be parasitic as well. So when monocytes are high, that starts to give you a cue that something has been going on for a while and it's chronic. So that's usually what you're going to see when monocytes are high. Again, usually over around 7% or so. Now, eosinophils. Now, these are really important because they actually contain histamine. So when you have an allergic response, it's going to be something like eosinophils that react. They degranulate. Mast cells are actually kind of in the same class here. They degranulate. They let go of histamine, and then you have that allergic type response to whatever kind of is going on. So they release this, and then it leads to kind of other things going on, leading to more of an inflammatory reaction that you need to kind of get over something. So that's usually something that you're going to see with eosinophils. Now, what can happen with eosinophils. It's very often, sometimes it could be infections, again, like parasites or fungi. It could be sometimes a respiratory infection because remember we're talking about asthma and stuff like that. So um, it could be asthma, could be allergies, could be hay fever. It could be something else that could lead to like an allergic reaction that can lead to eosinophils uh, going high too. So again, when we're looking at that, we're looking at ideally less than 3%. If they go over 3%, that's usually what we're thinking. Again, could be parasitic, could be fungal, could be some sort of allergic reaction to something. And then basophils are the smallest amount when it comes to like the percentage of total white blood cells out there, right? Again, usually when these are high, again, could be some inflammatory reaction, could also be intestinal parasites or fungal yeast imbalance. That's an issue. It could be inflammation that is chronic for a variety of reasons, even potentially. Um, Sometimes you could see this in a malignancy, although it's not as common, but could be usually when I think these are high, then you're thinking something in the gut that is overgrown or not at the ideal level. So when basophils are over 1, when eosinophils are over 3, when monocytes are generally over 7, then we're thinking either something chronic or something yeast, fungal, parasitic, mold that is causing an issue and is really worthwhile to dive deeper into that you could find on basic blood work that you're looking at when you go to your doctor's office. So when you see those different white blood cells, that's a good benchmark to kind of see. So if neutrophils are over 60, if lymphocytes are over 40, monocytes over 7, eosinophils over 3, basophils over 1%, again, these are all percentages, then you know certain things are kind of going on and is really important to kind of keep in mind so you can be educated. And when you go and talk to someone about this, you can have a more educated conversation and then really kind of be armed with some of the information that you need. Now, how does this affect the brain? Now, like I mentioned before, we already know that when we talked about this before, uh, we cognitive degeneration, dementia, depression are all things that are rising at an exponential rate and are, well, if we keep printing money, it won't, but can potentially cause real issues when we're talking about healthcare costs that are already, and again, in a country where we already spend more money on healthcare than anyone, yet we tend to have pretty poor outcomes nonetheless. What do we know that can help modify or limit the amount of damage that we know that can happen to the brain and boost the immune system, enhance the immune system? We already know physical activity, consuming fruits and vegetables in high amounts, maintaining social engagement, um, participating in intellectually stimulating activities. That could be, anything from playing a board game to doing exercises, ideally that include both sides of the body. So you're engaging that kind of cross crawl type pattern where you're engaging both hemispheres of the brain. It could be as simple as walking or running that can do it too. On the flip side, we also know things that can cause dementia or dementia like symptoms, like reactions to things like medications or nutrient deficiencies. Now, remember, we talked about this at the open that if you're consuming food like substances that are devoid of nutrients, you have to actually use nutrients to break down those foods, and then you're not even replacing them. Infections can do it, poisons can do it, poisonings can do it, brain tumors, hypoxia, low oxygen to the brain. Now we're talking about breathing patterns again. Why do I talk about nasal breathing all the time? It's because when you bring in that nitric oxide, you can dilate the bronchioles so you can get more efficient lungs so that you get more oxygen into the blood and then to the brain. When you get apoxia or hypoxia, low oxygen levels in the brain, that can lead to issues down the road. So these are all modifiable risk factors we're talking about when it comes to optimizing your brain health, right? Now, obviously, traumas can do it if there's concussions, but prescription medications and over the counter ones, heavy metals from again, dental or certain environmental, depending on the job that you're working or where you live. It could be mold, it could be other exposures, it could be injectables that there are heavy metals in. Hormone imbalances, endocrine disruptors. Now, again, we talked about these before. These are largely estrogen based, which again not only affects women, but at the same time, you have to remember that these things stack up over time. And particularly if you're carrying extra fat, a lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, they end up getting stored in fat tissue. And then it itself, fat tissue becomes an endocrine organ. So you have to remember that like a lot of this stuff, including things like strength training and exercise, the sometimes the least important part of this is the vanity of it. It's the fact that the more you can maintain muscle mass and engage the brain, particularly when you're doing exercises that incorporate both sides of both hemispheres of the brain, both sides of the body, that allows communication to stay open and more importantly, allow for more muscle mass, which in itself, muscle tissue is in itself almost an endocrine organ, but so is fat tissue. And that's where a lot of this stuff gets stored. Emotional stress can absolutely affect a healthy brain. I mean, we've seen it over the past 2.5 years. What do you think happens when people get locked down and told to stay inside and told to not communicate with other people? We are social beings, right? We need to be able to communicate with others and have that tribal aspect to our lives. If we do not have that, then that is going to negatively impact the brain, and so is poor sleep. So if you're stressed out all the time from different physical, chemical, emotional stresses, if you're stressed out because you're told your business is not essential, or you're scared to lose your job, is that going to affect your sleep? Yes, but it's also going to affect how you breathe, and you start to see how all of this stuff becomes full circle. I know that's a lot of talking, a lot of what's going on, but it's really important to see how all of this stuff kind of comes together, right? So again, we know now. Remember, you have your brain, right? You have the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The cerebellum's kind of the little brain you find almost at the back of the head here, at the back of the head. And we know that's the cerebellum essentially talks, is in communication with the cortex of the brain on a regular basis. And again, the more that we can stimulate both sides of the brain with different types of movement, with quality sleep, then it's going to be really hard to understand like how many of these things kind of come together. And when you stop doing that, when you are again driven by stress and using that as basing your reality on that, we now see that when there's atypical cortex function, there's atypical cerebellar function. These go hand in hand. Then you see different types of neurological disorders come up, like things like uh, being on the spectrum, or addictions, or OCD, or Parkinson's, or depression, or Tourette's or schizophrenia. Like all of these things go back and forth and work together. Like all of this stuff goes together and then affects how the immune system interacts. And why does this affect the immune system? Well, we're going to get into it. But what's really important with that is that, remember, we have the vagus nerve, right? That comes down from the brainstem, goes all the way to all of our internal organs, including the gut. We know the gut is called the second brain. And we also know that 90% of those fibers go back up to the brain. So we're taking that information from the gut, from essentially the outside world, sending that back up to the brain just to interpret how we should react. Now, this all happens unconsciously. We're not consciously making those decisions, but this is what's happening. This is how information gets funneled and then how we react to what's going on. Now, we talked about the vanity part, a little bit of exercise, but remember, the reason why regular exercise is so important is because it literally increases the building new blood vessels. It's called angiogenesis. Also increases neurogenesis and synaptogenesis. So what does that mean? You're building new blood vessels, you're building new neurons in the brain, and you're building new synapses, new connections between those neurons. That means they can now communicate in different ways that they might have been unable to before. But if we don't have enough oxygen sent to the brain, if we're not engaging the brain with different movements, with new movement patterns, with new um, different types of activities, then it will start to degrade over time. So when we have a healthy brain, essentially, that is going to directly affect how our nervous system's working and whether or not if that brain is going to deteriorate. Because we know that physical activity, if you are regularly exercising, your risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease drops dramatically. So when you start living a more sedentary life, when you're not moving on a regular basis or getting out in the sun, that is going to negatively affect. It's going to negatively affect how your brain operates, how your immune system operates, and the health of your gut, because these are all connected. So, and we know that physical activity can actually counteract neuronal loss and behavior deficits. Now, what does that mean? Literally, exercise can, because we're all going to lose neurons over time. We lose cells on a daily basis. Cells die, cells regenerate. But exercise can literally stave off that loss or rebuild new connections. And when those new connections are made, when those new pathways are made, we know that there are less behavioral issues that go along with it. And remember, we talked about the vagus nerve. This connects to all of our internal organs, right? Including the digestive tract. It's literally called the enteric nervous system, the gut-brain axis, where there's over 100 million neurons that connect the gut to the brain. And 90% of these fibers, like I said, go from the gut. From the gut to the brain. In other words, they're carrying all this information up so that it can then take it in and then do what we need to do with it. So only around 10% of it, or though, then that means is responsible for things like peristalsis, or keeping that gut moving, that peristalsis, right? That wave that we need things like fiber for, so that we can continue to go to the bathroom on a regular basis and then get rid of toxins on a regular basis. Because if we're not pooping every day, that means we're not detoxing appropriately. And if we're not detoxing appropriately, that means things like different toxins, like heavy metals, like endocrine disruptors, like excess estrogens, get recycled and potentially can get back into fat tissue or fattier tissue like the brain. And then you have to do all this stuff again. So this is why, if you've ever been interested in doing a detox or something of that sort, you have to make sure the drainage pathways you might have heard of are open. Are you sweating? Are you pooping? Are you peeing? Are you getting enough water? And are you diaphragmatically breathing? All of these things are going to move lymph, sweating, especially obviously if you're moving, using exercise. All of these things are going to play a role. Again, not only keeping the nervous system functioning at its best, but also the immune system. So, with that going on, we know that the gut brain axis, like we're talking about, there's going to be a huge connection with the gut microbiome. To a point now, they're actually called, believe it or not, that I came across something, it's called psychobiotics. So literally how microbes are affecting the psychology of people. In other words, like the composition of your gut can affect your HPA axis, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and which is your stress response. So if you have a gut that is out of whack, this can get back to the brain. If that leaves you in a more stressed state, that can lead to a stress response. You release cortisol, you release glucose, blood sugar goes up, inflammation goes up, and then you're now dealing with the space where a lot of the blood is going to be shifted into a more of a fight or flight mechanism. You're going to lose blood to the digestive tract, which means digestion essentially goes to the back seat. Not going to digest as appropriately, because remember, the nervous system is always going to prioritize living right now as opposed to living 3 days from now. Because if we don't survive right now, we're not going to make it till 3 days from now. So that's going to get kicked in, and it doesn't determine which stress is what. if it's actually literally a life or death type of situation. So it's important to keep that in mind. And again, with the vagus nerve, now remember, it does a lot of things, including controlling digestion, but it also helps control heart rate. It controls the immune response and also controls to a degree our mood. So how that innervation, that communication between the gut, between the brain, and then between the HPA axis, they're all going to work together in synchronicity. There is a synchronicity between them that will affect your health kind of long term. So what does this all mean if we're coming back to the gut then? Like if you're we can't that means we can't continue to consistently damage it on a regular basis with things like statins. We know statins, for example, damage the gut microbiome. So that's going to be an issue. We know NSAIDs can cause things like gastrointestinal bleeding, increased blood pressure, liver toxicity because we have to cycle that out, GI bleeding because it literally causes damage to the lining, increased blood pressure because, again, if that signal from the gut, from the vagus nerve going up to the brain, if that's stimulating a sympathetic response, guess what? That's going to mean your blood pressure is going to go up. Liver toxicity, because remember, we have to detoxify that, but also things like NSAIDs, we already know, create nutrient deficiencies, particularly things that we need for detox or for uh, proper health, like folate, like vitamin C, like iron, like calcium. So if we're not utilizing these properly, that can lead to issues down the road. And this is why it's important. Like if you can find things that are natural alternatives, for example, when you're talking about NSAIDs, usually that's pain. You could use things like ginger or cayenne pepper or turmeric or boswellia, things that can really help mitigate pain that are not going to have those same negative effects. PPIs, I talk about these all the time, but we know that proton pump inhibitors and other drugs that affect your stomach, affect your gut, are going to lead to things like osteoporosis. Why? Because if our stomach isn't acidic as it's supposed to be, we're not going to be able to break down the food that we can, which means as effectively as we can. And that means then we cannot get all the nutrients we need from the food that we're consuming, right? So if we don't have adequate stomach acid, and this is such a common thing that I see, this is why I really like digestive bitters, or if you really need them, sometimes pancreatic enzymes or betaine HCl, but I prefer the bitters because it'll stimulate your stomach to do it, or apple cider vinegar. All of these things are really, really useful to help um, bring those back into focus, right? So antibiotics too. So antibiotics, obviously, we know. I mean, we know antibiotics already are commonly overprescribed, and each time we take a round of those are going to affect the gut in a negative way long term. So, are we getting, excuse me, a lot of prebiotic, probiotics in before, during, and after an antibiotic regimen, or if are we absolutely sure we need them? There's a long time you're giving a lot of antibiotics for things like colds, and many of those are viral in origin. Where, guess what? Antibiotics aren't going to do anything. So, and these are just a few different types of medications, right? NSAID, statins, antibiotics, PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. You have to be able that remember that if you're over the age of 65, at least here in the United States, on average, you're taking 5 to 7 drugs per day, every day. And if you think only one of these is going to have an issue, imagine if if you're getting into a state of polypharmacy where you're taking multiple of these every day on the regular. You're going to affect the gut. You're going to affect how the immune system communicates with the gut. This is going to lead to things like leaky gut or intestinal permeability. Now you're talking about different types of food sensitivities. And then from there, it could go any number of different types of directions, particularly when you're talking about there's issues with the gut. Now, some of the tests are finally getting better, for this when we're talking about stool analyses and stuff like that. Um, Iridology or eye analysis you could see there's actually rings around the pupil if there's issue with the stomach or issues with the gut. So that's something that you could definitely look into as well. And you're wondering why, things like fungal yeast infections are so common, or different types of gut imbalances. Like I told you, I'm of the mindset that pretty much anyone in the United States or a westernized country at this point has some form of gut dysbiosis. It's just a question of to what degree. And it's just a question of, or a consequence really of what we're exposed to, on a daily basis. So, with digestive disorders, that is going to affect the brain. If that's going to affect the brain, that's going to affect the immune system. And there is literally a connection between the gut, the brain, and the immune system, and they're all intimately related, intricately related, and you can't really tease one from the other. So, like I said, if there's antibiotics or some other medications, like these are where things like probiotics can be really useful. I prefer them from real foods, ideally, like things like kimchi or sauerkraut, or different types of yogurts or kefir, or kefir. I say kefir. If there are infections, these are things like where or gut infections, I should say, probiotics can be useful. Sometimes you might need something a little stronger. Generally, my experience with probiotics is I try not to use them forever, because if they're not getting better, then there's something underlying that needs to be kind of taken care of. But if they help short term, that means it can definitely be helpful. Other things that we didn't even talk about yet are going to be things like glyphosate. Now, I talked about this last week, but again, keep in mind this is just one. This is just one um, herbicide that is used on a regular basis here in the United States, and we know that we find it in breast milk in moms. Like it gets all the way around. It survives the intestinal tract. The loophole with this is that they will say it doesn't affect human cells, which technically it doesn't, because it affects what they call the shikimate pathway. You can look this up. Human metabolism does not have a shikimate pathway, but bacterial cells do. So effectively, glyphosate, if you're not consuming organic beans or organic whole grains, you better believe glyphosate's on them, especially if you're in the United States. These are going to punch holes in the gut over time, because glyphosate is effectively an antibiotic in the gut. And again, when there's a disruption in that flora, in that microbiome, that's going to lead to issues down the road with the immune system. Because remember, if the gut gets leaky, now the immune system is reacting to something that wouldn't necessarily be there otherwise. This is why you get hypersensitivity reactions sometimes, with this stuff. So really important to keep that stuff in mind. Now remember, like I was talking about, we have 4 ways to detoxify, to get rid of things, right? It's poop, pee, breathing, and sweat. So essentially, are we doing those on a daily basis? That has to be something that we're doing on a regular basis to keep our bodies clean and moving. So, what are some other things that are really important, particularly for the immune system? Vitamin D is huge. Now, listen, this is going to be as straightforward as going out to getting sunlight. You know, it helps maintain strong bones, helps regulate a healthy immune system, helps optimize muscle function. It's when you have low vitamin D, it's associated with a variety of different things, including things like we were just talking about, digestive disorders, like skeletal osteoporosis, like depression, anxiety, other kind of mental disorders, developmental disorders, other types of brain dysfunction, chronic infections, cardiovascular disease, all different types of cancers, uh, aging, premature aging, I should say, and different types of autoimmune conditions. So, vitamin D is a huge one, and it's free medicine. It's right outside. Magnesium is another one. We already know that 80% of Americans are magnesium deficient, and this is really unfortunate because we need magnesium for over 300 different enzymatic reactions in the body. Really, really important. It's also really important to balance it with vitamin D, but also vitamins K and calcium. So there's a balance between all of these. Now, we know that when we're low in magnesium, it could lead to a lot of things we just talked about, like mood disorders, depression, anxiety, headaches, migraines, hormone imbalances is huge, diabetes, different types of neurological disorders, osteoporosis, fibromyalgia, heart disease, bowel disorders. All of these are associated with different type with magnesium deficiencies, right? Where do we get magnesium from? Dark leafy greens are huge. Different types of nuts and seeds. Squash seeds are huge. I always save them when I make squash. Pumpkin seeds are obviously a type of squash. Beans and lentils, sometimes certain types of fish, whole grains, avocados, dried fruits, most fruits in general, but dried fruits tend to be a little bit higher. Dark chocolate, bananas, like these are all things that are very easy to find good sources of magnesium. Nose breathing. We talked about this. I don't mean to like beat a dead bush with this, but this is part of the reason why, again, created the Breathe Easy course. And you could still save 20% on that by using the code Breathe Easy 20. You go to my website, you can order it. The reason nasal breathing is so important is because when we inhale through the nose, that we increase our oxygenation. We know oxygen in higher amounts can kill things like viruses and fungi and yeast. They need to survive in an anaerobic environment, but also increases the amount of nitric oxide available. So it's a bronchodilator and a vasodilator, and it will help lower your blood pressure. It helps increase oxygen absorption and helps balance those microbes while also boosting the immune system. So really, really important stuff. So that's when we're talking about some of the chemical and some of the physical stuff that we can do. The emotional stresses, this is where things like daily prayer, meditation is really useful. I do a meditation every morning. You could try something like emotional freedom technique or tapping or NET or NLP, neuro linguistic programming. All of these things are really, really useful. You could do affirmations on a regular basis. Something to help you manage with that is really, really key. Because remember, we have to pretty much get to a point where we're managing these stressors and then putting the immune system in a chance where it can really kind of survive. Now, we talked about, like I said, magnesium, vitamin D. The different types of antioxidants are going to be really helpful too. Vitamins A, C, and E, zinc, selenium, all of these things are really, really helpful. So when we're talking about getting all these stressors dealt with, make sure your nervous system is communicating properly with the rest of your body. Are you balancing that parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system? We want to limit our exposures to different neurotoxins, different heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, toxic foods, things like glyphosate. Um, you have to eliminate inflammatory foods like dairy, like gluten, um, like processed sugars and GMO foods. You want to make sure that you're getting into a place where it's largely plant-based, where you're getting a lot of those different nutrients you need, especially if it's organic. That is really, really big. Are you prioritizing your sleep? Your sleep is really, really key and very often overlooked. Like, are you setting up enough time, giving yourself enough time to really, really deal with that? So, is there heavy metals that you have to deal with? Do you need to do some sort of detox or chelation type thing? That's something, you could reach out to me about if that's something that you're interested in working on or with. So, all of these things to say that there's a lot of different things you can do. Um, and it's really about just identifying what the root is for you. So, those are kind of the big things that we're talking about when we're talking about the gut, the immune system, and the brain and how they're all related. So I hope that makes sense. Like I said, if you want to work with me one on one, we could talk more about this stuff in detail as it pertains to you. You can get in touch with me at my email, drvincentesposito@gmail.com. Get in touch with me on Instagram at Dr. Vincent Esposito. You could send me a message. More than happy to chat further with you. You can check out the Breathe Easy course. Again, go to my website under courses. You can save 20%. Use code Breathe Easy 20. That's what we got for today. So I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one. Bye. Okay.